Welcome into a Wednesday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Thank you for joining me, as always, John Alden, the host of In Touch with Indiana Sports. I hope you knew that, but if you didn't, you know now. Welcome in. Episode number 33, man. I know I mentioned a couple of days ago, or a couple of shows ago, I couldn't believe we already passed 30. But before we know it, we're going to be past 50 and 75, and we'll be at show number 100 probably sooner than I can actually imagine right now. So glad to have you on board. Going to have Alec Lasley on the show later on to talk some more Indiana football, Indiana basketball, as the Hoosier football team is in the midst of their bye week before they prepare to welcome Nebraska to town for homecoming on the 19th. And also Hoosier Hysteria the day before. Have we ever had, and this is probably a dumb question that answers itself, have we ever had a Hoosier Hysteria while the football team has yet to take a loss? I think the easy answer to that question is a resounding no. And wouldn't it be great if this could become the norm for Indiana football, where the expectation is to just have a good football team? Maybe not always a 6-0 football team, but a team that you know is going to be competing somewhere between the middle and the top tier of the Big Ten each and every season. And, that would just be, a wonderful thing for, for all parties involved, right? The fans, the players, the coaching staff, all that good stuff. So who knows? As long as Curt Cignetti is the guy at Indiana, maybe that's the case. So again, welcome in. We're officially in the midst too of this little streak of days. I believe from, I guess, this past Thursday all the way until Thanksgiving Day, you have football, whether it be college football or the NFL, at least one game on each of those days leading up to the Thanksgiving holiday. And then for somebody who's a football fiend, you got to be super excited about that. Maybe you took in a little Florida International versus Liberty last night on a Tuesday. Liberty ended up taking down Indiana's former opponent 31-24. And I'm glad I did not bet on that game, because as somebody who's had a lot of betting success over the last couple of weeks, I was very tempted to just put a little bit of something on the Tuesday night football game. And thankfully, I did not do that, because I would have probably gone towards Liberty to cover. And I believe that spread was somewhere between 14, 17, something like that. They only ended up winning by 7. So but they moved to 5-0. Not that anybody cares what the record of the Liberty Flames football team is, but Indiana's former opponent, FIU, now 2-4 on the year after that loss. The Fighting Pit Bulls, as maybe they will become known for, or known as, kind of jokingly, since they got Pitbull running their, not necessarily running their football program, but making some marketing decisions that helps, that's helping out their stadium and kind of bringing some NIL dollars and that type of stuff. So, but for those who want to indulge tonight, you also have New Mexico State at Jacksonville State. Won't be partaking in any betting there, but coming up on Thursday, there is a game of interest for myself, and that is when Western Kentucky hosts UTEP. WKU favored by 19.5 points, my alma mater. The UTEP team is 0-5, and WKU nearly pulled off an upset against a Power 4 program a couple of weeks ago in Boston College. And so I'm thinking that WKU should have no trouble at all when it comes to taking care of business against Texas El Paso, the Miners. So for those who want to get in on a little Thursday action tomorrow with me, I'm taking WKU minus 19.5. I'd almost go as far as to say that that's a free money play. But let's get into a couple of Indiana-related things before we bring on our weekly appearance from the publisher of HoosierIllustrated.com, Mr. Alec Lasley. For those who may be interested in buying Big Ten football championship tickets a little early, a little prematurely, some might say, especially if you're an Indiana fan, you still got plenty of season left to play. But if you're that confident, if you're somebody who's fully buying into this Indiana Hoosiers potential championship run, then you can go ahead and buy Big Ten championship football tickets for the game that will be played in Indianapolis. I mean, Kurt Cignetti, we've learned that he's a man of his word, and he's already, it feels like he just speaks things into existence, right? And he mentioned on his first appearance with Big Ten Network several months ago that he anticipates being back in Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship it won't be November, it'll be December by that point, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're somebody who is wants to be an early adopter and maybe just hoping that Indiana gets to that coveted Big Ten title appearance, because here's the other thing that comes along with it. You're almost guaranteed when you're a part of either the SEC or the Big Ten. And I don't even, maybe almost is not giving enough credit. I feel like the Big Ten runner-up and the SEC runner-up, unless the records just end up being completely wonky, which I doubt that will be the case in either of those two conferences. Not only are you making an appearance in the conference championship, but that almost all but guarantees that you'll be in the college football playoff as well with the 12 teams that will be invited to it. So it could be a double whammy for Indiana football fans, myself included. I don't know that I'll be able to attend the Big Ten championship, but man, if that ends up working out in my favor to where I can make that happen, then that would be wonderful if they even make the Big Ten championship. And I guess while we're talking about attending games, last Monday I was talking about with Mitchell the prospects of me being able to be in attendance for the Nebraska game. Well, unfortunately, now that we know the time of those games, of the game for Indiana, which will be at noon on Fox, making it the big noon kickoff game. And the way that works for me with Louisville versus Miami also being at noon, that unfortunately makes me ineligible to be in attendance for Indiana's game against Nebraska. So hopefully at some point this season, I can make it up to Bloomington for one of Indiana's few remaining home games, whether that be Washington. I already know that will be a no-go for me. I already know I won't be able to do the post-game show for that as well. Heck, actually, I won't be able to do the post-game show for Nebraska because of the Louisville stuff. So we'll have to figure out something, who's going to be filling in for me when it comes to post-game wrap-up duties now. But hopefully I can make it up for an Indiana home game, one of the last couple remaining, whether it be Michigan or Purdue. We'll have to wait and see. So, but that's neither here nor there. But if you are somebody who is interested, Indiana is doing some 2-packs, some Indiana football ticket 2-packs. If you're somebody who hasn't made it up to see the Hoosiers play this year, I guess you can either buy them. I don't know if you have the option to buy them in any choice that you want, or if it's like you have to do Nebraska and Washington and then Michigan and Purdue. I just know that they do have different 2-pack packages that you can choose from if you're somebody who will be able to make it up to a couple of different home games later on this year. So one basketball thing of note to talk about before we bring on Alec Lasley as well. Braylon Mullins has set his decision date to October 23rd. There was potential speculation, at least from people that I chat with, especially here at Hoosier Illustrated, that he might, or when I say Braylon Mullins may end up making a decision before then. People were talking about potentially at some point next week, where it's looking more so now. And to say looking, it is indeed going to be October 23rd when Braylon Mullins decides between North Carolina, UConn, and the Hoosiers. And again, it could be the second big piece to fall for Mike Woodson and company when it comes to the 2025 recruiting class. And at that point, I think I've said this before. If not, here we go again. Or I guess here we go for the first time. If you've not heard me say this before, this will be your first time hearing it. I do believe that if you can get at least 2 guys in your freshman class for basketball in this day and age where you can get guys from the portal, I do feel like 2 can more than, especially if the 2 guys are elite, where Sicily and Mullins kind of fall into that category. I think you can be satisfied with having a 2-man recruiting class. And of course, it's definitely good to get more if you can get more, especially if you're going to be losing a lot of guys in the outgoing senior class, or I guess you can never really predict how many guys are going to end up in the transfer portal. But in this era of the transfer portal, where it's a lot easier, we've already seen Mike Woodson take advantage of bringing in a number of guys from the transfer portal. I don't think it's nearly as necessary to have large freshman classes when it comes to basketball specifically. So, but that doesn't mean you don't want to still pursue guys like Bryson Tiller or an Eric Reeb. You still want to potentially find a way to get those guys to land on your roster and recruiting class as well. But if Indiana is able to, they've already got Sisley, but if you're able to pull in Braylon Mullins as well, then that becomes I think you can say you've hit the bare minimum of what you want to get in your basketball recruiting class for 2025. So those are some of your news and notes for Indiana football and basketball. We'll go over a couple of other things here in just a little bit. On the other side from Alec Lasley, my conversation with Alec Lasley, we're going to talk CFP projections again. That was one of my favorite little bits from last week's shows, is taking a look at what some of the guys from ESPN had when it comes to where Indiana is currently predicted to land. Do a little CFP bracketology, as I called it. So we'll do a little bit of that again on the other side. I'm also going to read some of your YouTube comments. I had somebody the other day, and I think this is actually the second time that this person has made this comment. I don't really know who it is. I mean, I know his name on YouTube. It's Agent All-Star 7. But he wrote this, John, start checking these comments instead of listening to Nickelback, with a little laughing face. And I believe he wrote something similar a couple of weeks ago. And first of all, Agent All-Star, I do read the comments. I don't necessarily go through them each and every show, but I will do some of that today. And in regards to the Nickelback thing, first of all, I'm not, for those who are unfamiliar, I'm not somebody who is afraid to say that I do enjoy listening to Nickelback every now and again. I'm not as big of a Nickelback listener as I was back in my youth. And when I say youth, I'm referring to really my high school days and earlier. I was really into Nickelback. Nickelback is the band that got me into the rest of the rock and roll music world. Like I listen to all sorts of rock and heavy metal nowadays, and that does still include Nickelback time and again. But they were the gateway to the rest of some would say the more sophisticated world of rock and heavy metal. But I'll leave it at that. Appreciate you listening and commenting, Agent All-Star. But we'll get into a few more comments as well on the other side, and then we'll do our weekly non-revenue shout-outs, talk about some of the things going on in the world of Indiana sports that maybe gets a little more ignored than the typical footballs and the basketballs and that type of thing. So we'll get to all that here in a little bit. But right now, let's go ahead and bring on Alec Lasley to talk all things Indiana football, basketball, and whatever else we might get into. So here we go. Happy Wednesday, Alec Lasley with me once again, early on a Wednesday morning. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Probably a little bit more chipper than you are this morning, based off of the early morning conversations.
Well, see, here's the thing, though. Whenever this airs, so like this will air in between whenever I'm doing my regular segment, so it's got to come off as if it's around, along those same lines of chipperness for my regular, solo segments, if you will. But getting a little meta there. Sometimes the listeners are pretty much aware that most of the pre-recorded segments, they can be recorded at all times of the day, sometimes not even on the day that it gets aired. So we do things however we want on In Touch with Indiana Sports sometimes.
Absolutely. Wouldn't be the way to do it without doing that with you.
Yeah. So I guess we'll start with Indiana football, since they are kind of at that halfway point of the season. Not only are they at a bye week, but they're 6-0. They played half their schedule, and I've mentioned it as that they've taken the dream scenario and they've accomplished it. They took the favorable beginning part of the schedule and found a way to remain unbeaten. And not only that, they look good doing it. It feels like they've really backed up the 6-0 record with showing that they may potentially be the real deal. And obviously things really take a turn for the more difficult, beginning with the Nebraska game in a couple of weeks. But this probably goes without saying, but there's no reason Indiana fans are not happy with what they've seen so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have to be ecstatic, right? I mean, everything that has gone the way that Indiana fans hoped has been the way that it has kind of come to fruition the first 6 weeks. And you look at the start of the season, and everyone looked at kind of UCLA and Maryland as potential. Maybe one of those two games you slip up, even if you lose both of them, right? You're still sitting at 4-2. I think a lot of people would have been happy, looking at a 4-2 record, kind of going into the heart of this schedule in the back half of it, which everyone knew was going to be significantly more difficult than the front half. But the way that they've played has truly been, I think, light years ahead of what anyone would have expected, especially with how dominant all of these performances have been. I mean, they've had their slip ups, they've had their moments from game to game, especially over the last couple of weeks that maybe haven't been up to par with the overall grand scheme of things and how they've played maybe earlier in the season, but they always find a way to either get out of a little rut, have a response when they need to, get a stop when they need to, or really kind of put the opponent away when they need to. And this is the first time that I can remember that this team has had a true killer's mentality when it comes to Indiana football. Definitely, in the most recent couple of seasons. But when this offense needs to go out and put points on the board, they do that. I mean, they struggled to begin that Northwestern game. They struggled at times through that Northwestern game to really put that team away. And then when they needed to, they ended up scoring on the last, I think it was 7 possessions after those first 2, and scored on the last 2 possessions that they had in the fourth quarter there, and really made sure that they had what it took late in games. And I think that's a separator when you look at the mentality of this staff from previous years, as well as they want to finish stronger than what they started. And not only has Kurt Cignetti talked about it, the players have talked about it, but that's when you're going to win games, right? You can definitely put yourself in a great position in the first and second quarter, but once you get to the third and fourth quarter, that's when the game is really decided. And this team has done a phenomenal job in the fourth quarter, specifically putting teams away and really kind of putting the clamps down and making sure that whatever kind of hope that opponent has is taken away really, really early on in that fourth quarter. And they did it again against Northwestern. I think you're gonna see those types of Northwestern games more and more throughout the rest of the season, right? Where maybe you're up by 10-14 at some point, but the game always seems a little bit closer than that score, and that's what it seemed like against Northwestern. It starts not obviously this weekend, but next weekend when they take the field again with a Nebraska team that's obviously playing extremely well this year. But I think you can now look at it as kind of the first true test where expectations really are heavily on Indiana's side. I mean, you looked at maybe the Maryland game that was that first real test. But I think just the expectations now, a couple of weeks later, you look at this team and you're like, all right, now there's a lot more pressure surrounding this program.
Oh, what's crazy is that it's going to continue. The bar will continue to raise just a little bit if they continue to find ways to win these games. Because if they beat Nebraska just as handily as they beat Maryland and Northwestern, then the pressure will be to do the same thing against Washington a week later, and so on and so forth, until you get to that final gauntlet that includes Ohio State, Michigan, and Purdue. I feel weird putting Purdue in that category at this point in the season, though, just because they aren't really living up to what people thought they would end up being. So they may end up the Purdue game may end up being a bit more of a more so difficult just in the rivalry sense, because this Purdue team, I don't believe, is going to be very good. But I want to ask you this, Alec. I don't think I've asked anybody this question just yet. At the beginning of the season, expectations were, bare minimum, get to a bowl game. Well, you know what? That's already happened. And I think at this point, people would be very disappointed if they ended the season losing 6 in a row and being 6-6. That would just be very just as shocking as starting the season 6-0 would be losing these last 6 games, I feel like. So what do you feel like is the new bare minimum for these final 6 games as Kurt Cignetti prepares to get this Indiana football team ready for Nebraska and beyond?
Yeah, that's tough, right? Because you'd look at the end of the season, sitting at 6-0, right? If you went and went 3-3 in these last 6 games, there's a lot different of a mentality
Yeah.
and kind of surrounding what the season ended up being than what you would have told people with 9 wins, in the beginning of August or even the beginning of September. And so it's difficult to say that, especially with what this schedule looks like. I mean, I never want to say there's a for sure win, but you look at
Yeah.
that Purdue game, and this year it just feels like there's no way Purdue has a shot in this game. The way that these first 6 weeks have transpired, especially since it's in Bloomington, and all the talk, right? Kurt Cignetti's talked about this rivalry a decent amount. Um, you look at Washington is kind of a weird team, right? They're coming off the win against Michigan,
I
albeit
think
at
Washington's your toughest team left outside of Ohio State based on
I
that
would
result.
agree. I would agree, and I think they have the blueprint to play at a very high level. I think the biggest thing for them is right how ready they're going to be coming to the Midwest, coming to the East Coast, like they did when they struggled against Rutgers, albeit a couple weeks ago, still kind of early in the season. So you look at that game as potentially a loss, but again, it's very difficult with if they win against Nebraska, right? You could expect a phenomenal crowd against Nebraska. I would assume homecoming. Then if you win that game the next week, right, you're 7-0 with a very difficult opponent in Washington coming in, and you would expect the crowd to be even better for that game, right? So a lot of this is it's difficult to say because you can really make a case for them, winning the majority of these games coming in. I think if they go 4-2 coming in, I think that's realistic, right? I have a hard time seeing them go undefeated. I have
Yeah.
a hard time even seeing them just end with one loss, and I think we all know that would realistically be Ohio State. Um,
I tend to think
in this
I've thrown out
scenario.
the idea that even if this particular team isn't one of the better ones left on their schedule, I, for some reason, worry about what might happen when they travel up to Michigan State, just because it is a road environment. They've not been on the road a lot this year. They'll go on the road against Ohio State, of course, later on in these last 6 games. But I
The,
do feel like that there's going to be a slip up that doesn't include Ohio State that is just one of those games where you don't look like the better team. And maybe that's just the Indiana football mentality that we're used to having. Like we just need to expect them to have a blip in the road at some point. So maybe I'm sure
it,
Kurt Signetti would not find that acceptable to be thinking like that, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but and that's the other game, right? I look at Ohio State and Michigan State as the two because you look at the road games that Indiana has had this year, right? A UCLA team that doesn't pack the stadium, and you could make the case that there were equally, if not more, IU fans at the UCLA game than there were UCLA fans, right?
Same with the Northwestern game,
exact. Then
honestly.
that was and exactly, and that's even if there were more Northwestern fans, right? That stadium only held about 12,000 people, so a much different type of venue than if it were at Northwestern's normal stadium or in other away field. So that's why I think that could be a true slip up. It's coming after two very very difficult hard fought games against Nebraska and Washington, right? And it's right in between that potential, Michigan, Ohio State matchup as well. So, that's a game that I think you definitely have to have circled on your calendar. And it wasn't one that I had circled at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
Just with everything and how it's transpired. Michigan State, kind of one of those teams that this year has kind of been really up and down, right? They beat Maryland, lose, get extremely dominated by Oregon in the second half of that game. But again, at home for a Michigan State team, they're going to show up, especially if you have a top 15, and at that point could be playoff contention Indiana team coming to your home field, right? They're going to show up for that game. And I look at that one definitely in addition to the Ohio State as those two that I think theoretically you could lose.
It's going to get interesting the further we get along with this, because the playoff picture becomes clear, but also you start to worry a little bit more about these potential slip-ups that we're talking about. If you find yourself at, an 8-0 and having to go win a crucial road game against somebody like a Michigan State, that even though you're better than them, good teams slip up. We saw Alabama do the unthinkable and lose to Vanderbilt this past weekend. So crazier things have happened. Let's do a little basketball discussion before we wrap things up here. We are obviously not far away from the unofficial tip-off with Hoosier Hysteria the day before Indiana takes on Nebraska. Usually a big recruiting weekend, at least for local guys. I was talking with Kyler about that on Monday. And then you have the first ever charity scrimmage coming up not long after that, where you'll get your first glance at Indiana basketball taking on Tennessee down in Knoxville. A good chance for fans to overreact, as I've said before, but also an environment we've never gotten to see Indiana play in against somebody that will be a good level of competition. But also, you're probably not going to see you're not going to see Mike Woodson pull all the punches in a game like that, where you don't want guys to get hurt. You want guys to stay healthy before the beginning of the regular season. But both of those events, with the Midnight Madness style of event and then this new charity scrimmage, definitely a good way to get your fix with Indiana basketball before things really get rolling in November.
Yeah, and like you said, right? I mean, it's a charity exhibition. It's a preseason environment, but it's going to be a very competitive one, and quite honestly, it's going to be a good measuring stick to kind of see where Indiana is headed into the season, and it's probably going to be one of the more tougher matchups that they have before Big Ten play. When you look at their non-conference schedule, obviously the key game outside of the battle for Atlantis, right, is South Carolina, which, is not going to be the expected to be the South Carolina of last year, right, that had a lot of really, really good talent, made the NCAA tournament. And you then turn to the battle for Atlantis, where, you're playing a Louisville team expected to, be obviously much better than the past 2 years,
Yes.
but a brand new staff there with Pat Kelsey, a lot of new players in that program. What's that team going to look like? I think you have to win that one from an Indiana perspective. And then, it's up to kind of what the rest of the battle for Atlantis looks like, right? They have that potential matchup with Gonzaga in the second round. I think that would be a phenomenal early test for them. A Gonzaga team that's expected to once again, be one of the top programs in the country after getting some guys back from injury that were expected to play big roles last year, that were kind of in and out of the lineup. But I think you look at outside of that, right? You have Providence and Arizona down at the bottom half of that bracket as kind of the other two that would theoretically be good, really strong measuring sticks for Indiana, that, you're only going to be able to play one of them potentially at the end of the day. And I think you have to go into the battle for Atlantis with the mindset of absolutely at least getting 2 wins out of all that. Because if you're not able to, right, that really kind of, puts you back into a phase of last year where, you really didn't have much in the non-conference, put a lot of pressure on trying to win a lot of conference games. And, albeit the Big Ten's probably going to be deeper than it was last year, there's still a lot of questions about where some of these teams really truly are going to rank when it is time for Big Ten tournament, NCAA tournament talk, which is obviously months and months down the road. But you don't want to have a team kind of limping into conference play, not really knowing how they stack up, and really putting a lot of pressure on winning a lot of those games, because we know how Big Ten play is. It's going to be a lot of teams beating up on each other, which is typically what it is. And there's probably going to be a couple games that you lose that you shouldn't. And we know how much Indiana has theoretically struggled on the road over the past couple of years as well. So they need to get off to a good start in the non-conference, but I think that Tennessee matchup is at least going to show them and at least get some confidence that they're able to, hypothetically, let's say, come out of there with a win, to kind of be a jump start to, what this team could be like throughout the season.
Yeah, and we've talked before about expectations, and with the Big Ten Media Day polls that came out, expected to finish second place right behind Purdue. That's going to only enhance what people are going to expect from Mike Woodson in his fourth year coming up this season. And the perception of the Big Ten, like you mentioned, a lot of that will come from what these top tier non-conference matchups end up looking like when Indiana goes down to the Bahamas, and then whatever the other top of the tier Big Ten teams end up playing in those types of events. If those teams don't perform well, and Indiana's included in that, that really shapes the early perception of what your league looks like and whether or not you're going to get the benefit of the doubt if you end up having a more difficult type of a conference schedule. So it is important for Indiana to play their part and at least win 2 of 3, as you mentioned, down in the Bahamas, because that Louisville game is going to be kind of a wild card because maybe Pat Kelsey ends up having his team ready to go and they end up being really good in year one, kind of similar to what we've seen with Kurt Signetti in Indiana football, for being honest. I'm not saying that's what they're going to end up doing, but you never know with the way that college football and basketball are nowadays, and you can totally flip your roster. You never really know what some of these new teams with brand new head coaches and brand new rosters, how good they're truly going to be. But again, when it comes to perception for yourself and your league, that game against Louisville is going to be a very, very important, the first turning point of the season, really. I mean, and you could even argue that it is South Carolina, but at the same time, there are, and this is probably unreasonable, a lot of Indiana fans kind of writing off that South Carolina as a game that they shouldn't really have any trouble with, when really at that point in the season, yeah, you'll have the Tennessee charity exhibition, but when it comes to really wanting to put in a good showing and where you're going to be playing your best players and winning the best result, Indiana is going to want to look good and take care of business in that game, because maybe you do end up facing a South Carolina team who down the road ends up being better than maybe it looks initially on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a, but by no means should anyone be writing that game off. It's one though that, you go in with that mentality of expecting to win that pretty easily, just based off of how the off seasons have transpired, the expectations for both teams, and the talent level for both teams. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you were to lose that game to South Carolina, that's going to put even a lot more stress and strain on this team going down to the Bahamas, and set themselves up for what already is a weak non-conference schedule in terms of top end talent. Again, from bottom up, it's a more difficult schedule than it was last year, because a lot of the other teams outside of the Power 5 schools that they're playing did finish the season higher in KenPom and are coming into this season projected to be better in the metrics than the teams finished last year that they played. But again, that's those teams are not going to move the needle when it comes to this team really trying to solidify itself to make a deep postseason run, which again, that's the expectation this year. Whether Mike Woodson wants it or not, I mean, he put it on himself as well, saying this is the most talented team that he's had in Bloomington, and so you need to have those expectations of it, kind of bare minimum second weekend tournament team come March, and so you can't slip up in any way when you're looking at postseason rankings and every game then mattering for that, especially when it comes to a soft top end of the non-conference schedule.
We'll chat more about this in the next few weeks as we get closer, especially whenever we get around the corner of the charity exhibition scrimmage, because that will be, again, your first real opportunity to see the team take the floor against, I say real opportunity, it's just kind of a glimpse. It's kind of like watching the spring game for Indiana football, a little bit different because you are playing a different level of competition than just yourself, of course, but it's something that you're going to see a lot more guys get minutes that maybe wouldn't get minutes otherwise, I would assume. Maybe I'm dead wrong about that. This is just the way that I see things going with it being an exhibition and you're not wanting to get guys hurt and that type of thing. But again, we'll keep an eye on that. Alec, appreciate your time as always, and I look forward to doing this again at some point next week.
No, I appreciate it, John. Have a good one, man.
Big shout out to Alec Lasley, as always, for taking the time to come on and talk Indiana football, basketball, that good stuff. Even if it does force me to get up a little earlier than I prefer, I still appreciate him figuring out what best works for him to be able to take some time on In Touch with Indiana Sports each and every week. All right, let's go ahead and get into, as I mentioned earlier, what is one of my, hopefully will continue to be one of my favorite segments as long as Indiana football continues to do what they've been doing, and that is just straight up win. And that is taking a look at some college football playoff bracketology. And it's not your traditional bracketology, of course. What we do here is we take a look at some of ESPN's, we'll call them quote unquote experts, right? Because, it's a very subjective term. But we're going to take it however many of the guys and gals that have made their potential 12-team playoff projections, and we'll see how that would match up in a bracketed format, how the Hoosiers would end up, or who they'd end up playing, if they moved on, who they'd play in the second round, that type of stuff. So, spoiler alert, I guess, if maybe it's not really a spoiler, it is what it is. The two guys that we're going to do a deep dive into once again, it's the same that believed in the Hoosiers last week, and there's only two. Maybe the further we get into this football season and the more Indiana continues to impress, maybe the more you'll see, the more people in these ESPN experts, so to speak, you'll see take a chance on putting Indiana into their college football playoff projections. But the two people that gave us some hope last week and are continuing to give us some hope this week is none other than Bill Connolly, the original early adopter of the Indiana Hoosiers, before anybody else was willing to jump on. The second guy is Harry Lyles Jr. They both have Indiana slated as the number 8 team currently in the college football playoff, which again would be astounding. Any sort of appearance for the Hoosiers in the college football playoff in year one of a brand new head coach. I mean, it's a very unique case study because it will allow other programs to realize that your past does not at all define what you can do in the here and now when it comes to this new day and age of college football, right? Because Indiana, for all intents and purposes, should not ever be competing for a spot in the college football playoff, even if it is a 12-team playoff, right? Because historically, Indiana's never been worth hardly anything except for a few one-off seasons. And maybe we'll learn in the future that this ends up being one of those one-off seasons. But my point with this being that with the way that you can transform a roster so quickly, bring in the guys that you want, there's no reason that any program in the country, especially at the Power 4 level, cannot have a single season turnaround similar to what Indiana is having, to where you're in these discussions potentially year in and year out. So without further ado, let's take a look at Bill Connolly's first, and the reason we're going to look at both of them, I know they're both slated at number 8, but the differences come whenever it's involved with who they're facing potentially in those the different games and stuff like that. So we'll start off with Bill Connolly, since he was the OG adopter of Indiana. Again, he's got them slated at number 8. And when you are the 8 seed, you are hosting the 9 seed in the first round of the playoff. And your prize for winning that game is a date with the number 1 overall seed in the college football playoff quarterfinals. So when it comes to Bill Connolly's list of teams, the number 9 team in his current college football playoff projections is none other than Kalen DeBoer in the Alabama Crimson Tide. For those who may be unaware, the reason they dropped so far is due to their loss against Vanderbilt and the Commodores, the monumental upset that took place this past weekend in the world of college football. But can you just sit and imagine for a second a scenario where there's a lot of things that, to kind of, pick apart here, if you will. Maybe that's not the best way to phrase it, but that's the way I've chosen to phrase it. But Indiana hosting a first round college football playoff match, that is something crazy in and of itself, right? And not only that, you're hosting a legendary football program that is Alabama. It's no longer Nick Saban's Alabama, but there is an added layer of intrigue when you now realize that the Alabama team that you would be facing is coached by none other than your former offensive coordinator, Kalen DeBoer, under the previous regime that was Tom Allen's. And some will say is more responsible for the success of Indiana football during his time here with the Hoosiers. And I don't think I would necessarily disagree with you if you're somebody who believes in that, because it's with somebody who is like Kalen DeBoer, who had the meteoric rise that he did. He had an impact on every team he's ever coached, whether it be as a coordinator or a head coach, and he's done it quickly. He's very similar to Curt Cignetti, just he's got to the higher level a little bit quicker than Curt Cignetti did. So, quick little coffee sip right there. But man, just the idea, and again, these games would be on Friday, December 20th or Saturday, December 21st. So you're talking about the edge of fall, the beginning of winter, right? So imagine a team like Alabama, used to playing in the deep South, of course, coming up to face an Indiana Hoosiers team in the very beginning of winter, Christmas time, of course, in an open air stadium. And again, winter can be very unpredictable, of course. We all know that. So there's no guarantee that it would be a cold and or snowy environment in that type of game. But it would be very interesting to see how that type of game would play out if the elements were to be involved in that specific matchup. So again, fun to talk about. Again, I'm sure just like me, you who are listening right now, it's tough to imagine just that being a reality down the road. But again, that's what these projections are for fun and for speculation, and just kind of doing a little sightseeing or foresight into the future to see what could potentially end up being the case for this Indiana football program. And if they win that game, of course, like I mentioned earlier, they'll face the number 1 seed, who, according to Bill Connolly, will be the Texas Longhorns. And you won't be hosting that team. You'll be playing in one of 4 bowl games, whether it be the Fiesta Bowl, Rose Bowl, Peach Bowl, Sugar Bowl. I don't know how they'll determine which team is playing where, but that'll be a neutral site game. You'd get a chance at the newly revamped Texas Longhorns under Steve Sarkisian, kind of been risen from the dead as of the last couple of years, made the college football playoff, the 14 playoff last year before losing to Washington in the semifinals. Again, Kalen DeBoer's Washington team. But that would be the ultimate test, right? If you got past Alabama at home and then you got to face the number 1 team in the country, then you'd really see how you stacked up, right? If this is indeed how it played out. Again, we don't know if Texas would legitimately be the number 1 team in the country at that point. But again, for the scenario's sake, you'd find out what you're really made of, right? Because if they are definitively the best team, then if you get whooped, then they're on a whole different planet than yourself, right? But if you make it competitive, then you know that you've done all that you can. I don't even want to necessarily humor winning, but if you've gotten that far, why can't you win, right? So we'll go and move on to, first of all, shout out to Bill Connolly for even for giving us this content, right? We'll move on to Harry Lyles Jr. And it's actually, I'm glad I already did kind of a deep dive, because even though there are some differences between some of the teams and where they're ranked, Harry Lyles Jr. and Bill Connolly both have the same scenario that just played out. I mentioned they're both 8 seeds, but they also both have Indiana facing Alabama as the 9, and then moving on to face Texas, they're the consensus number 1 according to all of these projections currently, and rightfully so. They haven't really given anybody a reason to say they should be otherwise. So, and I do believe you'll see Alabama specifically. If Alabama gets back on the right track, and maybe just say maybe one more loss would kind of solidify them as maybe that 9 spot, if they're able to still make the playoff like that. It'll be interesting to see as well if any teams that have 3 losses flirt with getting into the playoff. And I'm sure there's only a select few amount of teams that can really make that work for them. And of course, that's the cream of the crop of the SEC and the Big Ten. And I don't even know if Ohio State, I mean, you talk about the top teams in the Big Ten right now. Of course, you have Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State. all 3 of them unbeaten. I'm not sure how many of them could suffer 3 losses and still find themselves on, finding a way to get into the playoff. Two losses is definitely a lot more manageable than it used to be. The second loss used to be a death sentence whenever it came to the 4-team playoff. Now it's more so the third, and in some cases the fourth, depending on which team you are. And really, think about it like this, though. With the fact that there are auto bids, there will be times where, especially in some of these smaller power conferences like the ACC and the Big 12, there may be times where you've got, let's just say you have an 11-1 Clemson versus an 8-4 SMU, and 8-4 SMU decides that, not decides, but finds a way to defeat Clemson. They get that auto bid with 4 losses. And the only way that would work is if, let's just say, SMU's 3 losses were all to non-conference opponents, and they ended up going, I don't know, whatever that record, one loss in the ACC finds them in the ACC championship. That's where you can see that stuff potentially play out like that. So, one more sip of coffee as we move forward here. But it is fun to see these college football playoff projections. And as long as Indiana keeps winning, there's no reason to think that you may see, or there's no reason to think that more guys on this ESPN expert committee, if you will. And again, these are not the guys and girls that end up ultimately deciding who is going to be in the college football playoff. These are, of course, just projections. And really, we're only, 3 or 4 weeks away from the first college football playoff rankings. And I don't know if they're doing it earlier this year or not, but if I'm not mistaken, I feel like they usually begin around the 10-week mark of the season. And right now we're entering week 7. So we're not far away from seeing what an actual college football, the actual college football playoff rankings become. And that's when the AP poll becomes obsolete. That's when the coaches poll becomes obsolete. And really, for being honest, the coaches poll is already a step down when it comes to what people typically reference when it comes to rankings. Most people go towards the AP poll, which is interesting, though, because I remember when I was little, maybe it was just the time. I don't know what the best way to phrase it is, I guess. But I feel like whether it be with my family or just myself, I always reference the coaches poll. But maybe that was before the AP poll was a thing. And I say not before it was a thing, before it was referenced more often than the coaches poll. Again, this is probably just me, and I'm just silly like that. But for some reason, Child John remembers the coaches poll being what was typically referenced more often than the AP poll. So we'll go ahead and move on from this segment. It is fun to talk about some of these scenarios that could potentially play out depending on if Indiana can take care of business. And some of it, I mean, the taking care of business part, right? I mean, yes, they're favored against Nebraska, but that's going to be a very competitive game, or at least it's expected to be. If Indiana comes out and beats Nebraska by 2 touchdowns or more, I mean, that will, again, just be further proof that, okay, this Indiana team needs to be taken seriously by its opponents, future opponents, I should say. And I think at that point, every game raises the ceiling, right? We all talked about the beginning of the year, the bare minimum being get to a bowl game. Well, that's already happened, as I talked about with Alec earlier. And at this point, finishing the season 6-6 would be nothing short of, is a disaster the best way to say it? Would it really be a disaster? Because in my mind, it would be a disaster because it would mean you imploded, and anything that you were reaching for that originally seemed unlikely is just gone out of thin air, right? So we'll hopefully we won't have to go down have that conversation a few weeks down the road. But let's go ahead and move into some YouTube comments. I'm going to be taking some comments from the post-game wrap-up show on from over the weekend, as well as from Monday's episode. And again, I appreciate all of you for commenting and those who just want to share their thoughts and some stuff. Don't have time to get to every single one, but I will get to those that I can kind of run with a little bit. So I'm going to start with this one from B-Man95. He says, Florida is not a very enticing job. The only reason Sig would leave us is if IU doesn't commit the resources. And according to a recent Dennis Dodd article, he is operating with the 5th highest budget in the Big Ten and 13th nationally. So I assume he gets paid at IU. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting things you have to factor in when thinking about, would Curt Cignetti leave for another job if he gets offered one, whether it be in the middle of the season or at the end of the season. There's no scenario, I don't think, that he would ever leave the Indiana job in the middle of the year. He may quietly tell a Florida or somebody that he wants to, take the job once the season's over, that type of thing. But again, that's just speculation, of course. But saying Florida is not a very enticing job, I think there's a lot that is enticing about it when you think about their history as a football program in general. I know they've kind of been down in the dumps the last several years, but I mean, it is still Florida. It's kind of like when you compare Indiana basketball, right? Because Indiana basketball hasn't lived up to expectations, but there's still that history there, of course. And with Curt Cignetti, and we've talked about this numerous times, him being 63 years old does kind of put him in an interesting situation because he's likely not going to coach anywhere, whether that be Indiana or Florida or some other power job. He's likely not going to coach for maybe more than 10 to 12 years. I mean, again, you don't want to assume how long somebody is going to be healthy enough to do the head coaching job necessarily. But, nature takes its course, right? Eventually, you're going to have to stop doing your profession by a certain age because you eventually just won't be able to do the job that you're expected to do. And hopefully that doesn't mean that, you start failing and you have to retire, that type of thing, or maybe you get fired. Hopefully you're able to do it on your own terms and kind of realize that you're not able to do what you were supposed to do. But if resources are truly not an issue in Indiana, and I know there was a lot of bonuses and extensions that you now have to factor in after Indiana got their 6th win. And some of that may even go a step further the more games they continue to win, especially if he makes a Big Ten championship, all that type of stuff. But if Cignetti really is able to do all of what many thought was impossible with Indiana, like get to the Big Ten title, make the college football playoff, all those types of things, there's no reason to think that guys behind the scenes like Scott Dolson are not already coming up with a plan of how do we secure this guy, because almost any job, whether it's the Big Ten or the SEC, specifically from those two conferences, if it's not a Northwestern or a Vanderbilt, then I think you could almost kind of put them all on equal footing. Some may disagree with that, but with the money you have coming in from these TV deals with Fox, specifically for the Big Ten, and then ESPN with the SEC, and throw Notre Dame in as well with their NBC contract and all that stuff, there's no reason to think you can't be successful with that type of money coming into your program on top of your salary and all that type of stuff. So why would he leave to do the same thing at another job when he's already proven that, I don't want to say it doesn't take much, but the fact that you did it at Indiana so quickly, yeah, you could do it elsewhere, but what's the point, right? What's the difference? I mean, yeah, maybe it's easier to get more fan support at Florida, of course, than it is in Indiana for football specifically. But I believe that if you stay at Indiana or stay at any program long enough to make your mark more than just a year or two, I mean, fans will come to expect, okay, this is a new football program now. They will fill the stands regularly because this is the new standard for Indiana football. So that's just my thoughts on that. Hopefully, I mean, I'd love to keep having the conversation of what happens if he's gone, because if we're talking about that conversation, it means he continues to win. Hopefully it doesn't come to fruition where he actually leaves, right? But it is interesting to think about what, how that could end up playing out. Here we go. This is from Douglas Carlson, 9006. IU's defense leaves no margin for error on offense. The defense is very average. Fortunately, IU has a very methodical offense that eats up lots of clock time and rarely turns the ball over. Only 4 turnovers in the first 6 games. One of these days, reality will set in and the defense will get lit up by a good team. I believe somebody will put up a 35-point game against this defense before bowl season arrives. And that's probably true. And I'll start with that last comment. I mean, I'll point out the obvious here. I mean, when you face Ohio State, it wouldn't surprise me if we have one of those classic Kevin Wilson style games where the score is maybe 52-49. And yeah, that sounds like I'm talking about the defense not being very good. And I will say Indiana's defense, they're not incredible. They definitely leave some holes more often than not than you would like to see sometimes, especially when you saw some of the things that Northwestern was able to do, especially when it not only you look at what they did against Indiana, but what Northwestern wasn't able to do against other teams. And I know they didn't have Cam Porter in a couple of those games, but I mean, Washington only allowed Northwestern to score 5 points. But here's the other thing, the other side of the Indiana defense that even I forget about sometimes. And you talk about the 4 turnovers, right? Those all happened in one game. All of Indiana's turnovers happened against Maryland. And if I'm not mistaken, when Indiana turned the ball over each time in that game, Maryland did not score on the ensuing possession that they got the ball away from Indiana. So one thing I will say about this defense is that when they need to bow up, whenever they really need to kind of step up their game, right? I think they know how to do that. They may not be as talented as some of the offensive pieces that Indiana has, of course. But I think collectively, as a unit, they're able to put together stops when absolutely necessary against teams that they know that they're superior against. Now, again, back to the Ohio State comment that I made, it's going to be a little different whenever you face a team like the Buckeyes that at times may feel like they can just do whatever they want at will against you. But I do think that will be a shootout type of a game. Whether or not Indiana is able to get it done, especially in Columbus, that remains to be seen, of course. So, all right, let's get to a couple of these are easy. I say easy. They're just, they don't require a longer explanation. Dabney Offerman 595 says College Game Day would have been there if Nebraska would have come in undefeated. And we talked about that scenario, right? If Nebraska hadn't lost to Illinois and you've got 2 unbeatens, especially when one of those unbeatens is the historical Nebraska program, that would be potentially where College Game Day ends up at. But here's the other thing. Well, heck, I was about ready to say you got Oregon and Ohio State, but that's actually this weekend, not the following weekend. I don't know where College Game Day is going 2 weeks from now. I don't know if they've made that announcement just yet. But yeah, that was something I always had in the back of my mind back whenever we were talking about the perfect scenario. The dream scenario did happen for Indiana, but we didn't get the full version of it for Nebraska. There is still going to be a lot on the line for Nebraska. They are 5-1, going for bowl eligibility for the first time under Matt Rule for the first time in 10 to 15 years. I don't remember the exact length that it's been since they made the postseason, but it has been a while for the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and it will be a very contentious game for that matter. All right, let's go ahead. I'm going to try to get through some of these a little more quickly. Hope I'm not rambling, but I am coming up against my usual hour clock. Maybe I'll save some of these comments for later in the week for Friday's show, potentially. So let's see what some of these other comments say. Tanis says, Tuttle is too fragile to play against these Hoosiers. If he plays, he won't finish the game on the field. He's referring to mine and Mitchell's conversation talking about how Michigan is now in their 3rd quarterback, who is none other than Jack Tuttle. And, I mean, yeah, he's had some, if you remember with him being with Indiana, I mean, there were times that really any quarterback under the Tom Allen regime with the offensive line issues that were had, it was easy to see the guys as fragile quarterbacks. And I guess we'll have to see. There's probably some truth to that. And they're definitely, if Indiana's facing Michigan at home, which again, the game is at home, and you have a raucous environment and Tuttle's returning to Bloomington and, he's no longer on the Indiana sidelines and people are rooting against him, maybe he will be a little nervous, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's the case. So, yeah, I do hope to see, I do hope it is Jack Tuttle behind, under center for the Wolverines when they come in to face Indiana. Bruce Ham 6197 says Nebraska, Washington, and Michigan State all have bye weeks to prepare for IU. And yes, while that is true, with the double bye weeks in college football now, you're going to have a lot more of that happening. And of course, one of those, you're also going to be on a bye, and that includes this week with Nebraska. And yeah, that is all back-to-back games, of course, but I think one of the maybe what's the word for the way to phrase this? Something that is often taken into consideration and more of a factor in how people perceive the matchup to be whenever it comes to, oh, this team's coming off of a bye week. I think there is a lot more stock put into that than should be. Now, if you have a player injured, a key player injured, and they take the bye week to get healthy, I do think that is when having the bye week before an opponent is very beneficial. Other than that, though, I do think, I mean, you hear coaches all the time say that they'd rather stay in their regular routine. You can almost say that the bye week can be a disadvantage. It's depending on certain, when the bye week comes, of course. I mean, I always thought that the early bye weeks that some of these teams had to take this year, like UCLA, for example, that's horrible. No one wants to take a bye week in week 2 or week 3 for that matter. So yeah, it does give you extra time to prepare, but I do think that I don't think that's a thing to worry about if you're an Indiana fan. All right, let's do one more comment and then we'll move on. We'll do the non-revenue shout outs and then we'll call today here. But John Jacobs 5766 says, thank God for Rourke. The challenge for Cignetti going forward is, can you get QBs in the future who are as good as Rourke? And I think you definitely can, of course, especially if you're able to kind of keep your eyes out for guys at the G5 level who are ready to take that step up. I mean, you find a diamond in the rough like Rourke, who is going into his final year of eligibility, who has that, veteran mindset, and he knows how to, have the, what's the word? And I hate having my phone alarms go off whenever I'm in the middle of doing the, trying to answer a question. Don't like to be distracted, of course. But when you can find guys who have been around a long time and, they know how to stay calm, cool, and collected in high pressure situations, that's obviously the perfect scenario when it comes to finding a quarterback in the portal. Now, the other side of this is, do you solely rely on someone like Taven Jackson to take the reins next year? Because there is part of, kind of the traditionalist side, right, that wants to see the guy behind the current dude step up and take the job, right? But I think it would be very beneficial to have some healthy competition. Bring in somebody who may be the same year as Taven Jackson, or even, somebody older, I guess. But kind of give Taven Jackson some competition. If Taven's able to beat the guy that Cignetti brings in, then you've proven yourself that you are worthy. And then you've kind of found a way to earn it, right? Instead of just kind of being handed it to you. So it's very interesting navigating the portal and thinking about future quarterbacks. And you also you want to be able to give your new guys a chance, but at the same time, you also rather have someone who's very experienced so you can win immediately. It's a very tough puzzle to solve, because you want to be able to make all your players happy, and you want to see that value when it comes to the guys you recruited, right? You want to see that pay off on the field. So again, that remains to be seen, and we'll see what happens this offseason. And if guys like Taven Jackson decide to transfer out, or, even some of the newer guys, Alberto Mendoza, Tyler Cherry, I doubt any of those will transfer out, just because none of them would have expected to be the starter this year. But give it a couple more years. If they're not the guy, it wouldn't surprise me if they end up transferring out as well. So let's go ahead and get through some non-revenues. Again, if you commented on YouTube and if you plan on commenting in the future, I appreciate it as always. You can also, I haven't mentioned this in a while, you can also hit the hotline, 502-830-9195, if you want to leave a voice message for me to play on the show and react to. That is an option as well. So let's do a quick non-revenue sports shout out. And sometimes the shout outs aren't always as good. And we've kind of been following along with men's soccer. And men's soccer, one of the more historical programs when it comes to really all of the sports programs around IU with 8 national championships, and they've had multiple attempts to get their ninth, and they've failed at doing so in the last several years, unfortunately. But since we last checked in, it's been a bit. They've found ways to win certain games. I believe the last time we checked was right at the end of September. So they got to win against number 8 Wisconsin, which was big, 3-2. They drew Washington at home 2-2 as well, and then recently, really, this is last night against Kentucky, rival Kentucky. They were able to win 3-2. And so, yeah, 2 out of 3 wins, no losses since we last checked in. Things are actually, I do believe never mind. There were a couple more games. They drew 2-2 back at the end of September. And I don't remember mentioning their 1-0 loss against number 21 Maryland, and where the play was suspended in the 70th minute and resumed the following day. Again, that was the day that the big Hurricane Helene was making its way across the United States. So a very weird scenario to have play out right there. But yeah, Indiana men's soccer kind of getting things back on schedule, as Todd Yeagley is known to do when they've had slow starts in the past. So shout out to Todd Yeagley's program for getting a few wins, and they will continue with Penn State this Friday on the road, or excuse me, at home at Bill Armstrong Stadium, and then they'll travel to Ann Arbor next Tuesday to face the Michigan Wolverines. On the other hand, women's soccer got off to a very hot start. Talked about them quite a bit. And since then, things have unfortunately not been as kind to them when it comes to the schedule. Since we last checked in with them, I believe they lost to UCLA 1-0, lost to number 25 USC 2-0. They did get a win at Oregon 3-1. They followed that up with a loss to Washington 1-0. Maybe I should be saying 1-0, right? I'm a soccer guy. I know the term nil. Sometimes I think about saying those things. I'm like, people are going to think I'm being pretentious, right? But it is the proper way to say it, of course. And then they've also followed it up with a loss to number 11 Iowa, also 1-0. They do have a rivalry game with Purdue coming up Thursday in Bloomington, and then this Sunday they'll face Wisconsin at home as well. So hoping to see things turn around a little bit for the Indiana women's soccer program after they got off to, again, a very hot start at the beginning part of the season. Volleyball, currently 9-5. The last time we checked in with them, they had just done the Indiana Invitational. Since then, they played 2 different matches back to back, right? One at Notre Dame where they lost 3-0, 3 sets to nothing. And then they followed that up with a revenge game at home in Bloomington. They beat them 3 sets to 1. So shout out to getting some revenge in that game, right? And then since then, they had the double whammy when it comes to going out to the West Coast. They lost to Washington on the road, unfortunately, 3-0, 3 sets to nothing. And then number 11 Oregon lost 3-1 as well. But then they returned home for 2 home games. Defeated Michigan State 3-1, defeated Ohio State after that 3-1 as well. And then they will continue with number 14 Minnesota on Friday on the road, and they will return that Sunday to face number 3 Penn State in Bloomington. And again, for those who aren't aware, I don't follow volleyball super closely, but I am aware that women's volleyball in the Big Ten is one of the most difficult conferences when it comes to college volleyball. So Indiana seems like they're making do so far, kind of in the middle of the pack, 2-2 in conference play. And they'll have plenty of opportunities to get wins against ranked opponents later on this season. And last thing I'm going to shout out men's and women's swimming and diving. Somebody made a comment a couple of weeks ago on the YouTube how I don't remember if it was the men or the women's team that was preseason number 1. Or maybe they were collectively number 1. I don't know exactly how that works. But again, I'm also aware that men's and women's swimming and diving, some of the more historically successful programs when it comes to all of the athletics programs across the Indiana University teams and whatnot. But they will begin their slate of competition, if you will. This Friday, they'll have the Cream and Crimson exhibition. And then this weekend, they'll be partaking in the SMU Classic down in Dallas. And they'll continue on with their different invitationals and matchups. I don't want to sit here and pretend like I know all the different terminology for the way that these games are played. Are they even called games? They're like meets, right? And again, when I do these non-revenue shout outs, I don't want to sound foolish. It's more so just to give them a little bit of attention that otherwise often gets unnoticed. So I'll do my best at figuring out the best way to present it in the future. Maybe I don't do a good job of it right here necessarily. But I don't want to necessarily ignore all that's going on in the sports that don't get nearly the amount of attention that football and basketball do, especially because there are people who do comment like, what about this sport? What about this sport? And I know I can't give them a ton of time for multiple reasons, but I do want to give them shout outs every now and again. And that's why we try to do this at the end of the show each and every Wednesday. So again, thank you for sticking around. Again, another longer episode than usual. Some of you may like that. Some of you may dislike that. But again, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already on Hoosier Illustrated, our YouTube page. And if you'd like to know when we post new videos or go live for post-game wrap-up shows, hit that notifications bell. And you'll know exactly when we upload new material each and every time we do so. Also, check out everything going on at HoosierIllustrated.com from Kyler Staley, Alec Lasley, Drew Rosenberg, and Dylan Traeger. Again, wonderful staff. They write great stories, columns, whatever you want to call them, articles, that type of thing. Check out all they've got going on, especially when it comes to football and basketball. Great features they do. And, it doesn't cost anything to check out their website. There are certain sites out there you got to subscribe for all the good stuff. You don't have to do that at HoosierIllustrated.com. So check them out and check out the YouTube as well for all our video content. And talking about the Hoosiers, last thing, I do want to help these guys out too. I mean, not that they need my help. They're great at what they do, but I do want to shout them out. Kyler and Drew doing a mailbag episode tomorrow, Thursday, the 10th. If you have any questions for them, hit them up in their DMs, message them on Twitter, all that stuff, and they'll answer your questions on their mailbag episode of talking about the Hoosiers this week. So check that out. Until Friday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.